be in Matthew chapter 5 in a little while, but Matthew chapters 5 through 7, of course, is Matthew's account of Jesus preaching what is commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount. Luke also gives some record of it in Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through 49. By way of background, just prior to the sermon, Jesus went up into a mountain somewhere in the vicinity of Capernaum. Matthew, in his account, speaks of the sermon that was preached by Jesus, while Luke tells us why Jesus went up to the mountain and then what transpired upon the mountain prior to the sermon. According to Luke's account, Jesus, in Luke chapter 6, verse 12, he went up into the mountain to pray. And he continued all night in prayer. After an evening of prayer, Luke 6, verse 13, Jesus called unto him his disciples. And of them, the disciples, out of that group, he chose 12, whom he named apostles. Following this, verse 17 of Luke 6, Jesus, the 12 apostles, and the disciples, however many there were, descended from the mountain. And they're standing there in the plain, and a great multitude of people came to hear Jesus and to be healed. And in Luke 6, verse 19, the multitudes began to press upon him. And this is where Matthew's account begins. Matthew 5, verse 1, and seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain. Not all the way to the top, but just a little ways up into an elevated place to avoid the crowd. And it says, and when he was set, or when he was seated, his disciples came unto him. I believe included in that would be the apostles as well. It was at this point, Matthew 5, verse 2, that Jesus opened his mouth and taught them. So the sermon is for the disciples, the apostles, but it's in the hearing of this great multitude that had gathered. We read in Matthew 7, verse 29, at the end of the sermon, it is said that Jesus spoke with great authority. In other words, it was different. It was different than the religious rhetoric of the day. The Sermon on the Mount is a very practical sermon teaching us what kind of people God's people ought to be, both inwardly and externally. The central theme of the sermon is summarized in Matthew 5, verse 48. Be ye therefore perfect, complete, whole, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. The Sermon on the Mount has been called the manifesto of the King. And that's pretty much what it is. It offers instruction in the kingdom way of life. All of God's people on the earth at a given time make up the kingdom. That's the sphere in which you and I live life upon this earth, or should be. What the sermon offers, again, he's teaching us how to be a people of God's kingdom. Again, the saved on earth. This kingdom is simply the jurisdiction over which God rules through Jesus Christ. It is the sphere in which the saved live life upon this earth, the kingdom. It serves as a picture of a redeemed people under Christ's rule as they live their lives upon this earth. In John 18, verse 36, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not from hence." So it is a kingdom in the world, but it is not of the world. Everything about it is contrary to the ways of the world. And kingdom living, the life that we live in this kingdom, is not of or from this world. For the saved, our way of life is to be foreign to this world. God's people need to quit dragging non-kingdom values into God's kingdom. It happens all the time. Our passport says we're not citizens here. We belong to a kingdom. We're not citizens of this earth. So don't get overly concerned about this life, about this earth. We're not citizens here. We're citizens of heaven. We belong to a kingdom. So in the Sermon on the Mount, really it is a discipleship lesson. It teaches us what a disciple is, their characteristics, how they're to think. We're not citizens of this land. We're not to think like everybody else, nor are we to act like everyone else. The Sermon on the Mount teaches us how to react in life, how to think, how to act, how to react. So it is basically a statement of a child of God's role in this world. And really it serves as a litmus test to measure our spiritual development and the impact that we have in this life. Our text will be Matthew 5, verse 6. "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." In verses 3 through 12, you have the introduction of the subject matter. And the introduction really forms the foundation of the life that is being described. The life of a disciple. The life of a follower of Jesus Christ. And what is presented in verses 3 through 12 is diametrically opposed to the ways of the world, to the thinking of man, and to the thinking of man concerning a kingdom. So our subject this morning is spiritual hunger and thirst. Spiritual hunger and thirst. The first thing we see in this sermon is, again, the introduction, beginning with verse 3. You have what is called the Beatitudes. In verses 3 through 10, 8 times, there are the words, "Blessed are." And then what follows "blessed are" is descriptive of both the nature of the kingdom, but more importantly, the character of those of the kingdom. What follows "blessed are" is the fundamentals of this kingdom life. They're known as the Beatitudes. And by that simply means be of this attitude. Be of this attitude, or be this. In spite of how brief there's a great depth of meaning in these Beatitudes. In verses 3 through 10, there are 8 of these Beatitudes. Again, 8 times, blessed are. Then you come to verse 11, and you read for the 9th time, blessed are. But this is really just the second part of the 8th Beatitude. So really there are 8, not 9, Beatitudes. Now our text is the 4th, or it is the middle Beatitude. Leading up to this is verse 3, poor in spirit, meaning truly subject. That's where it all begins. Truly subject. We cannot live this kingdom life if we are not truly subject. So that's where it begins. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It is an awareness of one's own spiritual incompetence. It is an awareness of our own failure and our own unworthiness. And that results in a willingness to be governed by another, to be submitted to the throne and government of a king. In verse 4, we read, blessed are they that mourn. This follows poverty of spirit. The result of poverty of spirit is that there is a mourning over sin. There is a mourning over spiritual incompetence. There is a mourning over spiritual failure. In verse 5, you have blessed are the meek, which is a submissive spirit, simply waiting for orders from the king. You don't do anything until you receive your orders from the king. And these 3 lead into blessed are they. The they are the poor in spirit, those who mourn as a result of their poverty of spirit, and they are meek, or they have a spirit of submission before God. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness. So if we're poor in spirit, we will hunger and thirst after righteousness. If we mourn as a result of that poverty of spirit, that is, that poverty of spirit has an impact upon us, we will hunger and thirst after righteousness. And again, we will be meek. If we are poor in spirit, we'll be meek, and we will hunger and thirst after righteousness. So everything works back in an order. So let's consider the nature of this hunger and this thirst. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness. Luke, in his account, Luke 6, verse 21, mentions only hunger. That's all he mentions. He doesn't mention thirst. Matthew mentions both, hunger and thirst. And I believe hunger or thirst is just a way of expanding the image of hunger. But blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness. I think it's very difficult for you and I, living in the society in which we live, the culture in which we live, the times in which we live. It's very difficult for us to grasp the meaning of hunger and thirst. It's very difficult for us to grasp the depth and the degree of this hunger and thirst. we have not known what it is to be hungry and thirsty for more than just a passing moment. I'm hungry. I'm starved. And then we eat. Everything's fine. But I don't believe that's what this hunger and thirst is talking about. That kind of hunger. That kind of thirst. You go to the Middle East, where this would have transpired. In Bible times, and due to droughts and famines and wars and pestilence and just the overall climate and conditions, people often experienced hunger and thirst bordering death. I've been hungry, but never to the point of bordering death. And likewise with you. So, due to the conditions of the land, the people had to always think strategically, always making sure you don't want to get too far away from food. Don't want to get too far away from water. Starvation and dehydration were common. So the people would have a different perception. The people that Jesus is speaking to would have a different perception of hunger and thirst than you and I do. For you and I, it's just a passing thing. No great danger. It's not bordering death. There's no real suffering involved. Hunger and thirst, bordering death. There are a lot of diseases that go along with that, a lot of problems that go along with that. Diseases and problems that you and I are unfamiliar with. Many knew the degree of hunger and thirst. A hunger and thirst that would cause tremendous headaches, bloodshot eyes, the swelling of the tongue, lips turning purple and cracking, stomachs becoming swollen. And when Jesus said, "They which do hunger and thirst," I believe the people of that day would have a different understanding of hunger and thirst than you and I typically would. They would understand it just as Jesus meant it, as a consciousness of need to the point of desperation. To the point of desperation. It is a feeling, an inward gnawing of profound pain that gets more and more intense. Again, bordering on death. So when Jesus made reference to they which do hunger and thirst, He's speaking of a craving that is painfully felt. He's speaking of a strong and intense desire within, bordering on death. A single-minded obsession. I've got to have food. I've got to have water. But it's also a passionate force within. It's a driving pursuit that keeps you pushing, that keeps pushing you to reach out for what is needed. I believe that's the hunger and thirst that Jesus is talking about. A feeling of desperation. This hunger and thirst it's a controlling passion, a controlling ambition They which do hunger and thirst. He's speaking of the realization of a personal need, which in turn creates a desire for what is needed. And it's so desperate, there is a longing and passion of the heart. So he's really speaking of a condition of heart, a state of being, hunger and thirst. Now notice the object of the hunger and thirst. It is they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness. After righteousness. This is a righteousness that comes from God. In fact, this righteousness is really the major theme of the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, he says, "For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." So the righteousness that we're talking about is a righteousness that exceeds mere religion. It's far more than religious formality. It's more than a self-manufactured ritual. It's more than external show. It's a righteousness that exceeds religion. It is a righteousness that comes from God. Now, God's righteousness is twofold. There is the imputed righteousness of Christ, which we received at salvation. In that imputed righteousness, you and I were declared righteous. In the sight of God, Christ's righteousness becomes our justification. So it is a positional righteousness. All the saved have that. But then there is also an implanted righteousness, which all the saved have as well. And that is a new heart and a new mind. It is the divine nature within us. And it is really the cause. It is what leads to the hunger and thirst after righteousness. Again, if there is hunger and thirst, there must be life. You cannot have hunger and thirst where there is no life. And this hunger and thirst proceeds from a life. That is, Christ, the divine nature implanted within us. It's a practical righteousness. The imputed righteousness is a positional righteousness. This is a practical righteousness. It creates a desire within us. And every saved person has it. There is a desire for righteousness within because of the divine nature that's in us, because of the new heart. It is also looked at as a standard of righteousness. It is a conformity to Jesus Christ. It is a desire, it is a longing to be like the Lord Jesus Christ. And this is the object of the hunger and the thirst. A desire to be like Christ, bordering on death. A desperation to be like Christ. It speaks of our character, this righteousness. It speaks of our conduct. Character is what we are. Conduct is what we do based on what we are. Character, for the most part, is unseen. It's the hidden. It's the within. Conduct is external. Character is the root. Conduct is the fruit. So again, blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness. That righteousness is inclusive of a seeking of God to the point of death, bordering on death. I have to have God. I must have God. That's the hunger and thirst. That's a rarity today. Well, how do you know that? Because it says if you truly hunger and thirst, you will be filled with righteousness. And there aren't many filled with it. So, it is also inclusive of a seeking to obey God in all matters. I have to obey God. I must obey God. And it becomes a desperation. It is a striving to glorify God in all that we do. It is a desire to be rid of all sin, to be free from the power of sin, to be free from the control of sin, to be free from the desire to sin. And there is a hungering, there is a thirsting, bordering death to be free from sin. It is a desire to be filled with the Holy Spirit. This is all included in this righteousness. It is a pursuit of holiness. It is a desire to grow in grace, a desire to grow in godliness. It is a craving to walk with Him, to be in close fellowship with Him. It is a craving to trust Him more. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst. This is not just a passing hungering and thirsting. This is a hunger and a thirst that borders death. It is a desperation. I have to have these things. That needs to be us. When Jesus said, "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness," it is a desire for the spiritual. It is Psalm 4. Let's turn there. Psalm 42. We've preached from this many times. Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2. As the hart, the deer, panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after Thee, O God. That's the hunger and thirst that we're talking about. My soul thirsteth for God. Not just a passing thirst. This is a thirst of desperation for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Notice in Psalm 63 verse 1, this hunger and thirst is described again. O God, Thou art my God. Early will I seek Thee. My soul thirsteth for Thee. My flesh longeth for Thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is. Psalm 143. Psalm 143 and verse 6. I stretch forth my hands unto Thee. My soul thirsteth after Thee as a thirsty land. Isaiah 26, verse 9. Isaiah 26, verse 9. With my soul have I desired Thee in the night. Yea, with my spirit within me will I seek Thee early. That's this thirst. That's this hunger that Jesus is speaking about. So putting these verses together, this hunger and thirst basically comes down to this. It is a desire for God. A desire for God in our lives. A desire so strong that it borders death. A desire of desperation. I have to have God. And it reaches forth for the Lord. So it's a heart for God. It's what Paul expressed in Philippians 3:13 and 14. Reaching forth unto those things which are before. I press toward the mark, So it is a hunger, it is a thirst for more spiritually, to have more spiritually, to be more spiritually, to possess more spiritually. Again, it raises the question to the saved, and what needs to be personally examined is, do we possess this kind of hunger and thirst for righteousness? Desperate for it. Bordering death. I've got to have it. I've got to have it. Need to ask ourselves, what is our degree of hunger and thirst? What is our degree of hunger and thirst for more faith? For more love? What is our degree of hunger and thirst to be spiritually stronger? To be more learned spiritually? To be closer to the Lord? What is our degree of hunger and thirst to just be closer to God? To be more submitted? To be more yielded? To be more identified with Him? To be more victorious? Again, by way of personal examination, do we hunger and thirst for more of Christ in our lives? Is there anyone who has as much of Christ as they can possibly have in their lives? No. Do we hunger and thirst in this way that Jesus is speaking about for more of Christ in our lives? For more of Christ in our interests? For more of Christ in our ways? In our viewpoints and in our feelings and in our attitudes? In our pursuits? In our goals? Where does Christ fit in your goals? Well, I want to be retired at age such and such. Well, where does Christ fit in there? And I'm going to live in such and such. Where does Christ fit in? Oh, there ought to be a hunger and a thirst for more of Christ in our plans. People make plans all the time. And sadly, Christ isn't in most of them. Spirituality isn't in most of them. Again, we're talking about a consciousness of need to the point of desperation. Do I see my need of Christ? You go back to the day you were saved. You were brought to see your need of Christ to a point of desperation. You die if you did not receive Him. That should be all through our life. This hunger, this thirst, this inward gnawing, this inward craving, intense desire, drawing us to pursue, keeping us reaching out for the spiritual. Again, the hunger and thirst that Jesus is speaking of is one that borders death. It is the attitude of, I must have. I must have. I've got to have it. It's a hunger and thirst comparable to that of physical starvation and dehydration. Think about that individual. Think about the individual that is hungry to the point of death, that is thirsty to the point of death. That is a single-minded individual. What are they thinking about? Food and water. That's dominant in their thought process. Food and water become their priority, becomes their preoccupation. We're to be single-minded towards spiritual matters. You take a starving man to the point of death. You sit him down at a table filled with food. He's not going to complain about the chair. He could care less. He's not going to complain about the table. Well, you know, this is a pine table. I really kind of prefer oak. He's not going to care about that. I sure wish you had nicer plates. Doesn't matter. You realize the fork's on the wrong side of the plate. Those aren't starving people. Those are people who want to be catered to. Churches are filled with them. Not really hungry. They just simply want to be catered to. And a church makes a terrible mistake when they cater to them. You don't cater to them, guess what? They'll go somewhere else. And guess what? You'll be better off. But a starving individual doesn't complain about these things. One who is spiritually hungry does not walk into a church building and complain about the color of the carpet or the position of the flowers. They don't complain about those things. It doesn't matter. They want food. That's all they want. They have a single-minded obsession for food. We could preach a long time on that subject. Such an individual, a starving individual, they're driven. They'll do whatever is necessary to get food. And they're willing to overcome any obstacle in the way. There is an active drive to pursue food and water. And we need a spiritual hunger and thirst that propels us to seek, to pursue, to overcome, to reach out for the spiritual. Again, it is a hunger and thirst comparable to that of physical starvation and dehydration. Such an individual is a humble individual. They're willing to eat leftovers from someone else's plate. You say, well, I'll never do that. Well, you haven't been hungry enough. You get hungry enough, you'll do it. They'll eat out of a dumpster. Well, I'd never do that. You haven't been hungry enough. A man who is starving, there's no pride. He'll eat off the street. He'll eat off the floor. It doesn't matter. He just needs food. And all this is transferred over to the spiritual. And the man that is bordering death because of hunger and thirst, they're not too proud to go where the food is. Wherever it is. Might be in the dumpster. Doesn't matter. They're not too proud to go where the food is. Well, I'll tell you what. That church might preach the truth, but I'm not going back there. They're unfriendly. Well, you're not hungry. Because if you were hungry, it wouldn't matter. I got news for you. If I'm starving to the point of death, it can be the most unfriendly person in the world that hands me a piece of food. I'm going to take it. I'm going to be thankful for it. So we have a lot of people who want you to think, oh, I'm starving. No, you're not. Because you complain about everything. Blessed are they which hunger and thirst after righteousness. So what is the result? Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now notice, two words. Blessed and filled. Blessed and filled. The result is twofold: blessed and filled. The word blessed is defined in verse 12. Rejoice and be exceeding glad. That's the definition here of blessed. It is a gladness, a state of pleasure, delight, happiness, and joy. And this goes beyond earthly gladness and earthly experiences. The result of gladness is rejoicing. Rejoicing is the expression of gladness. And then back to our text, the other word is filled. They will be given what they desire. They will be filled. And this is what leads to blessed. Because notice what it says. Blessed, skip several words, for. For this reason, they shall be filled. So, they're blessed, they're happy, they're glad because they're filled. We, the saved, ought to be a people of hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Again, this is not a passing hunger, a passing thirst. The hungry and thirsty individual. Pastor, you realize that you preached 4 minutes over today? Yeah, what's your point? I know what your point is. I'm not hungry. I don't want it. They're not honest enough to say that. If you're starving, someone sits you down at a table, you don't care how long you got to sit there to eat. It's not going to matter. It's not going to matter. There are a lot of things that don't matter. Almost all church problems would be eliminated if churches were filled with people who hunger and thirst after righteousness, because they wouldn't think about all the other things that trouble them so much. Do we possess the hunger and thirst that Jesus is speaking of? Are we willing to ask the Lord to cause us to have that kind of hunger, that kind of thirst for righteousness every day? Every day. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in verse of song.